Welcome back. As stated in my previous videos, Trump, along with Obama, plays mirrored antichrists. This is why Trump has had his political career resurrected after a period of the 4 years of Biden. Just like Christ ascended to heaven after 40 days, and the resurrection following his death. The narrative today is playing in reverse. This time, it started with the ascension, when Trump ascended to the presidency first in 2017, had his crown stolen, spent a period of 4, and then was greeted with a resurrection as president in the 2024 election. This only leaves the death to be experienced, likely by the United States itself, the Christian nation. And of course, it is also an unmistakable mirror echo in time of the 2 non-consecutive terms of Grover Cleveland, where an assassination haunted a president both before and after his twin terms. But that presents us with a grievous problem. How so? Think about it. As we witnessed earlier, the first incidents of 2 non-consecutive terms of U.S. presidents had Benjamin Harrison as the midpoint, the 23rd president. In Trump's case, Biden, the 46th president, was the midpoint. Therefore, once again, 23 presidents passed before the next occurrence. That's not a coincidence. That's a replay. Somehow, the events of today once played in the past, likely as a natural result of the split-branch new timeline that I theorize was introduced, thanks to the Washington Monument. That said, we should see more of our contemporary years in the past as mirrored opposites. It's quite poetic, actually, that the American Empire should end just like it began. You see, not even 9 years after the monument went online, the United States would enjoy a rapid ascension as the global superpower. This was still the beginning of the theorized new timeline that I promote, was cleaved or otherwise divided and deliberately modified via the Washington Monument, which led to the drunken meandering of time back and forth to attempt to change and fix what had come before. Specifically, it was meant to correct the arrival of Christ, to erase that event from the minds of the masses, and to make it as if it never happened, by erasing the nation and the people created in the image of Christ. Sadly, our chosen handlers are merely following their first commandment, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." God the Father and Christ are in no way linked to the Jewish God of the Old Testament, which, as Christ told us, was Satan/Lucifer/the devil. I prove this undeniably in my books. Yes, I know, many will claim that those are all designations of different characters, but I argue that they all refer to schizophrenic manifestations describing evil itself. Indeed, in their efforts to erase Christ, our chosen handlers would brilliantly twist time and make it work for them. Along the way, the Jews would smartly become their own Messiah. They would engineer things so that they could be given a country of their own, thanks in large part to the entrance into World War I of the nation created in the image of Christ, the U.S., on Good Friday 1917 of all days, the day they murdered Christ 2,000 years earlier. I mean, can the symbolism get any clearer? The very day honoring the crucifixion of Christ just happens to be the day that the Christian nation of the United States declares war in World War I. This would lead to the Balfour Declaration precisely 30 weeks later. which was a statement by the British government supporting a home for the Jews in Palestine. If the U.S. hadn't stupidly entered the manufactured war, the Allies very likely would have lost. Indeed, over 50% of the U.S. population at the time came from the regions encompassing either Germany or Austria-Hungary, by far the biggest demographic in the country. We were a German nation. We are still a German nation. And this is very important, as we will soon see. And yet, Americans at the time were insidiously programmed to go kill their former countrymen, and very likely members of their own families, just like Ukraine and Russia have been programmed to kill each other today. Those who refused to be programmed were locked away in internment camps. Yes, indeed, the U.S. was goaded into that war, just like you were goaded into taking a bioweapon touted as a vaccine during COVID, or Convid. Don't you find it just a tad too convenient that those fighting the Great War were stuck in trenches and not making any gains after 3 years of war? Even though the Allies outnumbered the Central Powers? Was it gross incompetence or a grand plan? If the U.S. would have stayed out of it, the inept combatants would have eventually tired of fighting and worked on peace. But no, the U.S. allowed itself to be dragged into war. Why? Why was it so important that the United States, the Christian nation, get involved? The answer, quite simply, is so that they could take the credit and assume the natural karmic blame, the temporal debt assigned by the mirror. Every action leads to an equal and opposite reaction. If we would have stayed out of it, there would not have been a Hitler, and likely no World War II. The Germans would have never been humiliated or saddled with insane war reparations merely for coming to the aid of a neighboring country. Why was it important that the U.S. assume the karmic debt in World Wars I and II? So that the U.S. would have no choice other than to play the role of fascist Germany when the mirror eventually flipped, as is happening right now. The U.S. is dying, just as Germany died. Its destruction has been engineered. And in the mirror opposite of Japan being nuked in World War II, this time the German nation, the U.S., will be nuked in return. But it isn't just the United States assuming the role of Nazi Germany. Remember, a mirrored event will always flow from 1 into 2, and then 2 into 1 in the following iteration. Nazi Germany was a fascist state, and its original roles have been divided and given to 2 to play in the next iteration. The other modern fascist state, along with the United States, is Israel. The Israelis are the ones committing a genocide out in the open to mimic the genocide Germany allegedly performed in secret. All with the tacit approval of the blackmailed President Trump and most of Congress, thanks to Jeffrey Epstein. The Jews are the ones who consider themselves the master race, instead of the Aryans. They are the ones who seek to expand their country by invoking Lebensraum, living space, in the same cry Hitler invoked in the 1930s. Sooner or later, that same chosen elite, utilizing their sacred knowledge of time and the mirror, will engineer the total destruction of the United States. But before that happens, they will adeptly use the United States first in their efforts to rule the world, and turn it into a new Palestine. Just like the Palestinians were kept within a tiny walled region, the oligarchs want us all moved into similar 15-minute cities. This isn't to benefit the planet, it's to institute a system of totalitarian control, just like in Gaza, to keep the masses in internment camps where they can be managed. What the Chosen are doing in Gaza right now is what they have in store for the rest of the world, in particular, the United States. Christ could play Messiah all he wanted, but the only group ultimately being saved by Christ and elevated to rulers of the physical world would be the Jews. Remember the narrative. Christ came to save the Jews. All of this has been manipulated into being by the manipulation of events in time. Manufacture an event, and then let the natural mirrored echo bring about your desired outcome and do the work for you. But why the focus on so totally destroying Germans in particular? Remember, one of the elements of the altered timeline was the year of 3 emperors in Germany. So the Germans were clearly meant to be a major part of the narrative for some reason. But why Germany? Why not France or Spain or some other nation? What made Germany so important? The adjective German means of the same parents or grandparents. This literally refers to the events in Genesis regarding Adam and Eve, the source of mankind. Indeed, German may actually derive from gene. Since these are mirrored events, and since we are in the process of returning to Eden, the destruction of the original version of mankind would be focused on those of German ancestry. Do you also see the obvious symbolic linkage to Germany as the master race in World War II? This was overtly referring to the word German as meaning the original mankind, the master copy, so to speak. Noah's strange mix of children represented mankind version 2.0. One of those children was named Shem, of whom the Chosen claimed to descend. They also claim that they are racially superior to all other humans on this planet, just like the Nazis did. Isn't that interesting? It seems that the very people Hitler allegedly holocausted operate with exactly the same fascist methods and share the same superiority complex. They are genociding the Palestinians, and they consider themselves the master race. Yep, another mirror element of time, another karmic debt on display. Keep this in mind for later. And all of this insanity with the 2 world wars and present 3rd World War took place because the Washington Monument went online on 9 October 1888. It was virtually the precise midpoint between the birth of the United States on 4 July 1776 and 11 September 2001, the final moments of the crucifixion of the United States, playing in reverse. All of this was encoded with the date of the 3rd and final Kaiser, Wilhelm II, when he abdicated his throne 9 November 1918, or 11/9, a mirror of 9/11. The former was the date of death for the Second German Reich, while the latter was the date of death for the United States. As we discussed much earlier in Part 6, Act 1. Just 59 days separate those events, with 59 being the 17th prime. As we discussed, 17 is very important in the year of 3 emperors and on 9/11. This adeptly serves as a perfect companion when paired with the Jack the Ripper narrative that I believe planted the seeds for those destroyed buildings on 9/11. all of this was meant to bring about the crucifixion of the United States. I know what you're saying, and I know what you're thinking. This is nothing more than delusional nonsense. If so, how do you explain the following? As stated in the last section, it is critical to understand that the twin non-consecutive terms of Grover Cleveland introduced all of the assassinations to occur in U.S. history. They all radiated both forward and backward in time from a central point, brought about by the contrived changes in the timeline, made it ground zero when the Washington Monument went online. But not only that, William Henry Harrison, the oldest president elected until Ronald Reagan, was the first to die in office, while John F. Kennedy was one of the youngest presidents elected and the last to die in office to date. Of the 8 total presidents who have died in office, the precise midpoint, with 4 deaths before and 4 deaths after, were the 2 non-consecutive terms of Grover Cleveland and the man in the middle, Benjamin Harrison, the cleavage site. This was the location of the first temporal incursion by the Washington Monument. This was the point at which time was cleaved, the midpoint of all the U.S. presidents, the midpoint of all presidents to die in office, and it was the midpoint of the 4 presidential assassinations, with 2 occurring before and 2 occurring after. This is not a fluke. This is not a coincidence. This is scientific fact. This was the undeniable location of a brutal rip in time, as detailed in my last 3 books, The Great Replay, The Masters of the Mirror Return to Eden, and The Great Deception, What If We Are All Satanists? This is where a Trump second term is pointing us, this second occurrence of a non-consecutive term, back to the first time that it happened. These events must replay. This would naturally represent a mirrored echo when the cleaved timelines attempt to fully reintegrate in a unified timeline once again, with the associated inflooding of time. The first tendrils of a 60-year-long process that I believe began around 1960. That was when we started reliving the events that occurred in the latter part of the 19th and the early part of the 20th century. As such, those assassinations must occur again, although this time they will likely be felt as the death of the United States itself, a nation deliberately fashioned by the Freemasons in the image of Christ, instead of the death of a president. As I have repeatedly stated, the operation of the mirror is 1 into 2 and then 2 into 1. The United States was only created so that it could be ritually destroyed. As I was literally getting to this point in the creation of this video, conservative influencer Charlie Kirk was allegedly assassinated. I say allegedly because you simply can't believe anything you see today. And there were so many illogical inconsistencies with the established narrative, including the suspension of the laws of physics, that we can't be sure of anything. I will create another video discussing this in more depth at some point, but for now, it's important to note that this incident involving Charlie Kirk was the beginning of that insane crucifixion of which I speak, that moved backward through time to encompass 9/11. And no, this is not hyperbole or me trying to pick something to fit my crazy ideas. The government and the media went out of their way to portray Charlie as some sort of saint, even insinuating that he was like Christ. For example, because his body was like the man of steel by stopping a high-power bullet. Charlie means free man, and Kirk means church. In essence, he functioned like another echo of Christ, or perhaps even John the Baptist. Indeed, many aspects of his death mimicked the death of Christ, from the way it made people feel, to the public nature, to the cheering crowds, after instead of before, the angering of Jews by words they didn't like, the president that washes his hands of everything relating to Israel, just like Pilate. Basically, all of those aspects that Trump himself didn't fulfill once he reached the point of being shot in his ear. What better symbolic signal for the beginning of the crucifixion of the Christian nation of the United States than the murder of the Christian Charlie Kirk? They even included a German Mauser 98 as the rifle allegedly used to shoot Charlie. A rifle that entered service in 1898. This was deliberately included in the narrative to serve as a message regarding the beginning of the American Empire, which we will soon discuss. This was the turning point for the United States, just like Kirk founded the organization Turning Point USA. This is the point where the American Empire, functioning like Germany, comes to its end. It's all in the names, boys and girls. And, of course, this was all the direct mirrored replay of those assassinations that took place both before and after the non-consecutive terms of Grover Cleveland, and their defining midpoint, the Washington Monument, going online on 9 October 1888. Instead of occurring before and after, this time the assassination took place during the non-consecutive terms. But how? How can a mass of stone and steel like the Washington Monument possibly create a rip in time? I can't answer that. I only point to the Washington Monument because of the timing, and because, long before I figured out this link, I performed the needle and laser test, and I understood the symbolism it represented. I was able to apply that understanding on a larger scale to the Washington Monument. Could there be another causal element, with the phallic monument merely providing the visual distraction? Of course. Indeed, there very likely is a hidden machine employed somewhere that is ultimately responsible, but who was able to wield that kind of technology back in 1888? Perhaps it was some invention of Nikola Tesla, especially since he was heavily involved in AC research at the time. Or was it employed from the future? Now, I'm willing to concede that my conclusions are totally incorrect, but it doesn't change the facts that I have presented. Please, give us your personal theories to explain why 1888 seems to be the midpoint of all the assassinations of U.S. presidents and of all who died while in office, while also being the only location prior to 2024 of 2 non-consecutive terms of U.S. presidents. You tell us why both of these non-consecutive terms were separated by 23 presidents. You explain everything I've brought up in this treatise, in my other videos, or in my books. I'm open to other interpretations, but I'm not open to dismissing it as being nothing more than a coincidence. There are no coincidences. Based on all the evidence that I have uncovered, I am providing the only logical and scientific conclusions. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that I am correct. The Whitechapel murders would certainly tend to augment my belief that we are dealing with the death of the Christian nation of the United States. Whitechapel definitely references Christianity. Likewise, the brutal mutilation of the final victim, the 7-year-old boy, John Gill, whom I hypothesized represented the destruction of World Trade Center Building 7, the final building to fall that day, is quite revealing in the fact that one of his ears was strangely removed. Doesn't this sound suspiciously like Donald Trump, a character playing the role of Christ, being shot in his ear during an alleged assassination attempt? WTC-7 was also known as the Salomon Brothers Building, which symbolically represented Solomon's Temple, created to honor the Jewish God of the Old Testament, which itself represents the mirror opposite of Christ, the Antichrist, since 9/11 represented the final stages of the mirror opposite of Christ's crucifixion, to be explained in another video. This was the vaunted Third Temple to be built in the end times. And then there was President William McKinley, overseer of America's ascension as a world empire and the successor of Grover Cleveland, who was eventually murdered a few months into his second term. As you can see, the virus injected into the timeline in 1888 wasted no time, pardon the pun, in beginning to realize the ultimate goal, just 3 weeks shy of 13 complete years into the future, from the Washington Monument going online, two numbers that have appeared throughout my research and other videos, and 7 years into the past with the murder of James Garfield a few months into his first term. This means that the positioning of the Washington Monument on the crossing was at the 1/3, 2/3 split, with 1/3 being in the past and 2/3 being in the future, just like the law of birthright states. These are the deaths of U.S. presidents, which are the sole representatives of the country created in the image of Christ. They are the figureheads, the scapegoats, the ones to whom the buck stops, to paraphrase Harry Truman. In the case of William McKinley, however, his death followed a very brief war that was completely manufactured by the media, thanks to the strategically placed false flag, the mysterious destruction of USS Maine. Maine was named after the 23rd state to join the Union, while the 23rd president, Benjamin Harrison, was elected in 1888 at the Maine temporal incursion point, right between the twin Cleveland administrations. Specifically, it too was at the 1/3, 2/3 division point of the combined Cleveland to Harrison-Cleveland terms. With respect to the solar analemma, this is the point of the crossing. Oh, and did I happen to mention that USS Maine was laid down 8 days after the Washington Monument went online in 1888? Are all of these elements simply another set of impossible coincidences? No, my fellow souls. Indeed, we can likely look for other false flags involving the U.S. Navy, the media, and a violent war, which will serve to end the United States in the days ahead, just like this cutoff timeline began, and just like the U.S. entry into World War II would begin by the false flag attack on Pearl Harbor, engineered and facilitated by the U.S. government. These are mirror echoes in time that were programmed to occur. In order to properly understand these mirror echoes in time and how they work, it is critically important to identify the roles that people play. For example, does Donald Trump solely mimic Grover Cleveland, the first president to enjoy 2 non-consecutive terms? An argument can certainly be made in favor of that position. After all, the tariff situation was a major campaign issue in the 1888 election, and Cleveland was against it, likely the major reason for his loss. That was yet another natural mirror echo to Trump's insane love of tariffs. Or perhaps does he better portray William McKinley? We know that, Mirrored events experience a 2-into-1 or a 1-into-2 cleaving, either joining into one or being split into two, of action/reaction. Trump could, therefore, be replaying in a similar fashion the events that two once shared in the past, just as he and Obama reprised the role of Christ. So what about McKinley? Could he be someone Trump is reprising? While McKinley certainly is a viable possibility, their personalities simply don't seem to fit. However, there was someone around at that time that Trump did adeptly emulate. In the 1900 election, McKinley's running mate was Teddy Roosevelt, a very boisterous man's man if there ever was one. During the Spanish-American War in 1898, he resigned as Assistant Secretary of the Navy and co-formed the 1st U.S. Volunteer Cavalry Regiment with Colonel Leonard Wood, a doctor. Known as the Rough Riders, they were a very diverse group of men, including cowboys and Native Americans, commanded by a former Confederate general, Joseph Wheeler. Well, that certainly sounds like the script for a movie, doesn't it? The Assistant Secretary of the Navy, working with an Army colonel, a doctor no less, to form a special team that literally included cowboys and Indians, and commanded by a former enemy? And did I mention that although they were named the Rough Riders, few had any horses in Cuba, since they had to be left behind due to logistics issues? Roosevelt, seeing the possibilities of his political career being enhanced by his military exploits, may have taken unnecessary and ill-advised risks with his men. For example, he led a charge up Kettle Hill, but he had not received orders to take the hill. The combined charges up both Kettle and San Juan Hills came at a cost of 200 dead and 1,000 wounded, some of the most bloody of the ever-so-brief war. History records the victory, and everything else is forgotten. It may have been a different story had the charge failed. Why give this background? Teddy Roosevelt certainly sounds a lot like Donald Trump, doesn't he? Impulsive, brash, egotistical. No, Trump certainly wasn't a war hero. He's a mirror echo, after all. But they do have the very same boisterous temperament. And they both do have a way of using the military to satisfy their own egos. My point is that they could have come from the same mold. Heck, both Roosevelt and Trump are even from New York. The former is from Manhattan, and the latter is from Queens. Notice the mirror difference? Manhattan and Queens, male and female. Roosevelt became president after McKinley was assassinated. He finished that term and was elected to a second term in 1904. He chose not to run for a third term, instead endorsing William Howard Taft for president in 1908. A schism quickly developed between the two, and Roosevelt eventually sought the nomination for president in 1912, after being approached by a group of Republicans from Taft's home state of Ohio. Notice that Roosevelt sought his own non-consecutive terms, just like Trump. Taft, however, won the nomination, so Roosevelt left the party and started the Progressive Party, also known as Bull Moose. Here we see that Roosevelt was clearly a mirror opposite of Trump. Indeed, instead of being a staunch conservative, Roosevelt and many conservatives were staunch progressives that admired liberalism. Like Roosevelt created the Bull Moose Party, Trump had MAGA, the Make America Great Again wing of conservatives. Roosevelt had the Great White Fleet, a force of 16 battleships that sailed the world while being painted white, while Trump is constantly bragging about the U.S. military and threatening to use it, Trump even increased their budget to $1.5 trillion to fight imaginary enemies. But Trump did have a fellow famous businessman as backer, Elon Musk, who has his own fleet of ships, spaceships, rockets that can return to Earth and land instead of burning up or splashing down. These spaceships launch satellites in long, bright white trains of lights, visually very similar to seeing a long train of giant white battleships at sea off your coast. One is on the Earth, and the other is in the sky. Musk and Trump apparently had a falling out, although I believe nothing when it comes to either one of them. And Musk threatened to create his own party, the America Party, just like Teddy Roosevelt had a falling out with someone he originally backed, William Howard Taft, and created his own party, the Progressive Party. And when Trump was sworn in for his second term, he didn't place his hand on a Bible. This precisely mirrors Roosevelt's first term following the death of William McKinley, when no Bible was used. And finally, Roosevelt was also the driving force behind the U.S. construction of the Panama Canal, a canal that was coincidentally finished just in time for World War I to begin. Hauntingly, one of the very first things Trump stated he wanted at the beginning of his second term was the return of the Panama Canal. All of these things are uncontrollable mirror aspects of the same characters and the same events separated by a century. But we're just getting started. On 14 October 1912, Teddy Roosevelt was shot in front of the Gilpatrick Hotel in Milwaukee by John Schrank, a mentally compromised individual who believed that the ghost of William McKinley had asked him to kill Roosevelt. The bullet fired by Schrank lodged in Roosevelt's chest after passing through his heavy coat, his once folded 50-page speech, and his metal eyeglass case. Since he wasn't coughing up blood, Roosevelt correctly deduced that the bullet hadn't penetrated his lung. He refused medical treatment and instead chose to give his speech with blood seeping onto his shirt, a speech which lasted 90 minutes. Think about this, my fellow souls. Doesn't this sound a lot like Trump's failed assassination attempt? Trump mimicked Roosevelt by standing up with his fist raised into the air, shouting, "Fight, fight, fight." He mimicked Roosevelt's 90-minute speech by giving his own 93-minute speech, albeit 5 days later, at the Republican National Convention. Oh, and did I mention that those speeches both took place in Milwaukee? But it gets better. You see, in the 1912 election, Roosevelt's entrance split the Republican vote. He won 27%, Taft won 23%, and Democrat Woodrow Wilson won it all with just 42% of the vote. An electoral landslide. Is this not what was setting up to happen with Robert Kennedy Jr., Kamala Harris, and Donald Trump seeking the presidency in 2024? But then, suddenly, on 23 August 2024, Kennedy dissolved his bid for the presidency and openly endorsed Trump. This time, two of the candidates joined forces to keep the Democrat from winning, instead of two splitting the vote. Again, a perfect mirror opposite. Oh, but it still gets better. The winner of the 1912 election, Woodrow Wilson, won his re-election bid in 1916. However, on 2 October 1919, he suffered a debilitating stroke, which left him paralyzed on the left side and with only partial vision in his right eye. His influential wife, Edith, and his physician, Cary Grayson, kept him sequestered from everyone. Indeed, it has been said by some that Edith effectively became the first female president of the United States, something Kamala Harris was seeking. Wilson's inner circle concealed the severity of his affliction. Likewise, the vice president at the time refused to claim the presidency. Despite his medical incapacity, Wilson nevertheless wanted to run for a third term, but party leaders refused. Does this not sound very similar to the incapacity suffered by Joe Biden? His wife had been photographed sitting in his chair. Who knows what sort of decisions she made for him? Everyone involved, from the vice president to the media to the administration officials, all lied to the public regarding the true extent of his infirmities. Kamala Harris, who sought to be the first official female president, should have claimed the presidency, but she didn't, just like with Wilson. She was forced to act exactly as events before played out, because this was a mere echo in time. And of course, we all know how Sleepy Joe adamantly stated that he was running for a second term. Eventually, however, the party forced him to change his mind, likely committing an outright coup in the process and effectively taking his crown, just as they had done with Trump 4 years earlier. We even have Robert Kennedy Jr. to portray the ending of the Kennedy political dynasty, which properly mimics the beginning of the Roosevelt political dynasty, as represented by Teddy Roosevelt. These similarities are beyond astounding. They reveal that a clear replay of history is taking place, as highlighted in my book, The Great Replay. All of these elements have become reflected, as if in a mirror. But why and how? And why does all of this seem to result from the time period centering around the 23rd president, Benjamin Harrison? Some sort of temporal incursion took place with the completion of the Washington Monument, and events in time began to play differently, regardless of whether or not you think this sounds like impossible science fiction. All of this was programmed into this hijacked timeline way back into the months around October of 1888. But how? How did the Freemasons know how to do this? Clearly, they had access to ancient hidden knowledge. What other knowledge do they possess? The ability to manipulate the weather, perhaps? As I stated, it is my belief that this Jack the Ripper of time event was brought about in order to try to fix the arrival of Christ and to make the Jews rulers of the world. Consider that they would hold a meeting of the First Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland on 29 August 1897. The Spanish-American War would begin 33 weeks later. Yep, there's that sacred number 33 again. And 13.67 years after the war ended, the ship purporting to be the Titanic sinks, which, as I reveal in my books, was simply a replay of the story of Christ. And very likely the story of the USS Maine. Again, the sacred number 13 is in play. 119 weeks later, World War I begins. World War I was the result of the murder of Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife a month earlier, which, too, was a replay of the crucifixion of Christ. 33 months after the assassination, the U.S. declared war on Germany on Good Friday, 1917. And what took place during World War I? The Armenian Genocide, from whence the word was coined, which primarily involved Christians. And finally, 33 years after the sinking of Titanic, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japanese cities, the land of the rising sun, or symbolically referencing the land of the risen sun. Not only did the satanic U.S. government deliberately target civilians, but for the second attack at Nagasaki, they deliberately targeted a Christian church, the Urakami Cathedral, completed just 20 years earlier. But it wasn't just any old church. It was the center of Roman Catholicism in Japan for nearly 400 years, since Francis Xavier introduced Christianity to Japan in 1549. Again, the death or destruction of Christ is rife throughout these years. Oh, and I should mention that church, the Urakami Cathedral, had twin towers, twin bell towers, symbolically very similar to the twin towers destroyed on 9/11. Are you beginning to grasp the true symbolic import of the twin towers on 9/11 and what they meant? It is directly linked back to the masculine two parts of the law of birthright, God the Father and Christ. It symbolically represented the destruction of Christ, the death of Christ. In 1900, an Ohioan, McKinley, and a New Yorker, Roosevelt, won an election. A few months later, the Ohioan was assassinated, and the New Yorker took over. An Ohioan, Taft, then won in 1908. In 1912, an Ohioan and a New Yorker lost. The day after Trump's assassination attempt, he named Ohioan J.D. Vance to be his running mate. A New Yorker and an Ohioan were brought together again, and they won. History repeats. Now, fast forward to 10 September 2025, and the day Charlie Kirk was allegedly assassinated. Was Charlie also from Ohio? No, but his wife Erica claimed to be, although no city is ever listed, and I cannot verify the birth of a Franz V in Ohio's records. Erica took over the reins of Turning Point USA, the company Charlie founded, after his death, so she benefited from his work. Here we have an alleged Ohioan benefiting from an assassination as a perfect mirror echo in time to the Ohioan that was assassinated, William McKinley. Why is this important? The template for what must be in the days ahead can be found lethargically languishing in the painted and painful past. Whether we are reliving what came before, or whether what transpired in the first half of the 20th century was merely a reflection of today, focused backward in time as I believe, it is ultimately irrelevant. The United States is actively reliving those years in a mirrored manner, and the ultimate destination of our so-called enemies in those tempestuous days is becoming our own destination. We are Germany and Japan of those years, and a crushed and nuked future impatiently awaits us. Likewise, Christians are playing the Jews of the Holocaust. Only this time, it will be a real Holocaust. The roles have reversed, and, like the growth of Jack the Ripper's murders to 9/11, exponentially enhanced. Manufactured justice and balance is on tap. And all of it is based on lies and engineered reality. Nothing here is real. Most of history is fiction. Events in time primarily serve as a carrier to bring death and pain and anguish to the soul. Like money, your reality is generated out of thin air and given power based on nothing more than your faith in its tangibility. We are the scapegoats for the chosen to project their sins upon, and the innocent Gentiles, the gentle peoples, upon whom they seek to blame for their own degenerate depravity. Why? Because they are perpetual victims, and they are the caretakers of these hallowed halls of hell. Their God, as Christ warned us, is Satan. And no, you cannot separate Judaism from Zionism. It is all Satanism. Just as much of Christianity is Satanism, unless you are able to separate God the Father from the fake God of the Old Testament. The God of the Old Testament is Satan/Lucifer, and it is female. And we are all living a nightmare. Of course, it is likely that many of you are laughing at this research or dismissing it outright. Well, there is one other temporal anomaly from the 1888 time period that I haven't mentioned yet. You see, in 1889, just a few months after the Washington Monument went online, a lawyer named Ingersoll Lockwood released a book entitled Travels and Adventures of Little Baron Trump and His Wonderful Dog Bulger. It tells the story of a very Donald Trump-like boy named Baron Trump. Intriguing, since Donald has a son named Baron. And then, in 1896, Lockwood released a book called 1900, or The Last President, in which a populist candidate elected in 1900 brings about the downfall of the American Republic. What are the odds, boys and girls? A book about Trump and a president that brings about the destruction of America, written by the same man, around the very same point in time that I revealed, has been hijacked, and right in the very time frame of the first non-consecutive terms for a U.S. president. Something that wouldn't occur again until a person named Trump became president. Maybe we should find some so-called scientists to look at my data and attempt to explain this. Nah, I'm not holding my breath. As you can plainly see, many events happening today also happened in the first few decades of the last century. The parallels are undeniable. Are these events actively replaying today, or did they, as I believe and as I discovered in my book, The Great Replay, likely originate in these end of days taking place now, at the very end of this cell of time, and were somehow reflected backward in time at some critical juncture in the future? Either situation is scientifically plausible, given current theories. Ultimately, however, it doesn't matter. What does matter is that from our perspective, these events are replaying. That means that the past, in particular, those years from 1888 to 1960, must fully replay. I've already documented dozens of examples in my books, including predicting a pandemic occurring around the year 2020 in a book I released in 2017, 3 years before. This naturally must include wild weather, a failed world economy, a fascist state committing genocide, as replayed by Israel today, Asian countries on the march to world domination, and most importantly, the unnecessary employment of nuclear weapons to begin a war as opposed to using them to end a war. These are all mere aspects of time. They all must play as they played before, and the events themselves cannot be changed. This game is totally controlled. This game has been gamed by AI-like systems to the max. Every eventuality has been checked. Every loose cannon dealt with. This is hell, and it is the playground of the chosen. In my last book, The Great Deception, What If We Are All Satanists?, I reveal that there can only be 45 unique presidents, based on the sacred square or the sacred cube. something that I uncovered in the very first chapter of my very first book way back in 2010. Why only 45 presidents? Because that is the sum of all digital root numbers from 1 to 9. Biden, while being known as the 46th president, was actually only the 45th unique president, thanks to the 2 non-consecutive terms of Grover Cleveland. Everything goes back to that temporal two-step in 1888, doesn't it? This is why Kamala couldn't take over for Sleepy Joe. This is why Trump will not have a new successor. Trump is unique president number 44. This simple fact cannot be changed. That said, these words do not preclude someone like Bush or Clinton or Obama from temporarily taking the reins as president in their own non-consecutive terms once again, even though term limits supposedly prevent it. But it won't matter. All it will be is another weekend at Bernie's, with them holding up the corpse of the United States to have a little more fun with us. The country and the world will fall in a very short time. If you found this topic interesting, then please check out my other videos and my books. My website is www.mastersofthemirror.com. Thanks.